over again, I wouldn't trade that for the world.
There were handsome, long hair musicians playing wonderful music, which you could see no place else.
There was nothing like that in Fort Worth. It was mainly cowboys. It was a very strange place to be if you weren't accustomed to that type of place.
It kind of laid down the marker for being different.
There were women able to come in there and play music.
And you know that you're in a place that you've never been anywhere like this in your life.
Well, you could do anything and everything at the Cellar. Whatever you think went on, did.
It was the place to go to hear good music.
Working Main Street downtown, watching while the cellar goes down. We played all day, and then we'd play all night. We'd slave and never say anything for the morning light. Working Main Street downtown, watching while the cellar goes down.
Fort Worth has such a great legacy of badness that goes back to Hell's Half Acre popping up almost simultaneously, but in the wake of the establishment of Camp Worth, Fort Worth.
Fort Worth has always been this town, at least in the early days, that had this reputation. It was wild and woolly and wide open. This was where the cowboys came at the end of the trail drive, when they drive the longhorn steers up to North Texas from the big ranches in West Texas and South Texas. It was where they spent their money, and there were all the attractions that you might imagine. I mean, you go all the way back to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Fort Worth is where they came to relax.
Man, this was wilder than most wild parts of towns in Texas or elsewhere. But it established this tradition that carried on to Camp Bowie. We had the military camp on the west side to train pilots during World War I, which later became Thunder Road, Jacksboro Highway.
Now, the Jacksboro Highway in those days was a pretty rough place. This is a place where Delbert McClinton, where Willie Nelson, who was selling used cars in Fort Worth in those days, these are the clubs where they performed. And these were the places where you actually had chicken wire up in front of the bandstand, because people would often throw beer bottles and beer cans and things like that at the band.
Pat Kirkwood was, you know, his club, the Four Deuces, was one of the most infamous gambling joints, not just on the Jacksboro Highway, but in all of Texas.
They would play upon the oil men that would come into Fort Worth. And any cab driver that would bring an oil man from the Hotel Texas out to Kirkwood's place, you know, Kirkwood Senior, would get a $100 tip.
These were all part of, I think, our DNA of whatever Fort Worthers are, that really manifested themselves one more time in the Cellar, basically taking that hoodlum era of the 50s and translating it into the 1960s. Just this wild underworld, all these things, illicit, illegal, under the table. We did it better than they did in Dallas, than they did in Galveston or anywhere else, pretty much between Hot Springs and maybe Los Angeles.
But I think this whole idea of the Cellar sort of grew out of that attitude. Fort Worth was always a place where people in Dallas came to have fun, and still is to some extent. Especially those of us who are from Fort Worth, we choose to believe that. Eamon Carter Sr. was one of the most amazing people. I mean, he got up in the morning thinking about, what can I do to promote Fort Worth? And he was a great promoter of Fort Worth. I don't know where Fort Worth would be today had it not been for Eamon.
The 1936 Centennial of Texas was held in Dallas, which burned Eamon Carter is asked to no end. I mean, he was not happy with it, so that's when he decided to do the Pioneer Palace. He brought in Broadway producer Billy Rose and the exotic dancer Sally Rand to do her fan dance, and came up with the motto, go to Dallas for culture, come to Fort Worth for fun. When he'd go do business in Dallas, he'd take a sack lunch because he didn't want to spend any money in Dallas.
It is true. He would not go to Dallas and eat in a Dallas restaurant. He always insisted on taking his lunch when he went to Dallas and told everybody about it.
His love of gambling was such that when he really wanted to go hog wild, or when his wife wanted to gamble on bridge, they would go to Pat Kirkwood's daddy at the, W.C. Kirkwood at the Four Deuces. And Mr. Kirkwood knew well enough to shut the doors at certain times when your leadership had to go do their gambling. And so Eamon Carter deserves a lot of credit for what became the Cellar, not only through his patronage of the Four Deuces, but through his acceptance of the fact that leadership, or looking at a city is more than just what we read officially, we read about in the newspaper. So he controlled this city. He understood who we are and who Texans are, and we have a game face, an official face that you will see in civic affairs or at church on Sundays, and then we've got our other face that you will see at social functions or in nightclubs or in after-hour joints like the Cellar.
Well, I was there the very first night it opened, which was September the 24th, 1959. And it was closed to the public, but the publicity was already breaking in the newspapers. In 1962, Kirkwood opened the San Antonio Cellar. And it was only open for, I think, like 6 or 8 weeks, a very short time. Well, the military put them off limits, and it killed the place. The Houston Cellar opened December the 7th, 1966. The Dallas Cellar opened November 1st, 1968.
The Cellar was an alternative. Kirkwood considered himself an intellectual, and his place was alternative. Instead of having blues or hillbilly like all the other clubs in town had, he had jazz and folk music. He didn't sell alcohol. He was not there to draw a full house all the time. He was there so that interesting people would come around.
He wanted a place to party at, and so figured that that's what he'd do, is open up a club. And there was nothing like that in Fort Worth. It was mainly cowboys. So it was a very strange place to be if you weren't accustomed to that type of place.
Most of the crowd came after hours from the theater district. About 12:30, you'd see the tuxedos and evening gowns coming down the stairs. And of course, they wouldn't sit in the cushions out in the middle. They would sit at the tables in the back in regular chairs.
Well, the Cellar just, it continued to progress, and it would get publicity just from the antics and things that the owner would do and stir up. Inside the Cellar, all the walls were black, painted black, and slogans on the walls were painted in white. And he decided, the first stunt he did, he went out and painted the parking meters out in front of the club black. Well, that upset the city. Of course, we're in the paper the next day.
I always thought he was just the epitome of evil. But come to find out that I learned some stuff about him. He was an artist. He did metal sculpture, which I never knew. He was just the big bad guy. He and all his cronies would come roaring in there with their guns and money, guns, and lawyers.
Oh my God. Pat, wow. That's a hard one to explain.
But he was an ex-race car driver. He drove stock cars for 20 years and was very successful at it. And being a race driver, you got to be pretty tough.
Pat was the kind of guy you hated to love him and you loved to hate him. He was very, very sinister in many ways. I used to call him the devil man. He had a stare that when he looked at you, he looked right through you, and it kind of melted you and made you feel unsafe again, yet again. So I think a lot of what went on in the cellar was just a personification of his attitude of life and just an extension of his personality.
I would say he's probably the most eccentric man I've ever met. Yeah. Generous, you know, but if you got on his wrong side, you know, you just didn't do that.
Kirkwood was a master of publicity and being able to milk any situation for all it was worth for himself.
The reason it became so widely known is Phil Record, who was a night police reporter at the Star-Telegram, would often go down there after he got off work at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And it became just an ongoing story in the Star-Telegram.
He was a Western code sort of a guy, you know. He was into chivalry. I mean, he was into being nice to the girls. You know, you didn't be rude to the girls. You didn't be rude at all. He wanted his customers to be polite. You know, have a good time, but be polite. That was the watchword. You know, don't be rude. Don't be grabby.
One night, Kirkwood came into the cellar, and he was wearing military jodhpurs, high boots, carrying a riding crop. And he informed us, he shut the sound down and informed everyone that he'd seen this movie, Patton, and thought it was the best movie that has ever been made, and he thought everyone should see it. So he decided to close the cellar. It was around midnight. Went out to the Cherry Lane drive-in that he had rented, but was already there, and he was standing at the ticket booth with his riding crop, and every car that would go by, he'd whack it on the fender and go, move it, move it, move it.
My respect for Pat has grown over the years to have pulled off what he pulled off in this kind of environment. You know, the city of Fort Worth, the official leadership, whenever they needed to, I'm sure whenever they needed to gussy up their image, they could have just picked on Pat all the time, and they did some. But they didn't to the point where they kept him from doing his business. And I think he performed a public service. He provided an outlet for all of the others. And we found out there are more others than the official version of Fort Worth ever recognized.
Everyone keeps talking about how mysterious Pat Kirkwood was. That's because he wouldn't open up, and he wouldn't he wouldn't show all of his aces. I mean, he wasn't going to show you his whole hand. That mystery was his power. No one knew if they could push him. They didn't know whether to believe the stories or if they were myths. No one knew how far to push him. And so they didn't. I think the cellar was our Oz, and I think Pat Kirkwood was the wizard.
The original joint was downstairs. Everybody in the cellar calls it the joint. You know, we never called it club, gig, everything was always a joint. And we went down this flight of stairs, and this guy came streaking out. And a guy in a black shirt that had the cellar written on it came out behind him chasing, and he had a chrome-plated .45 in his hand. And I thought, okay, I like this place.
Oh, it was Fantasyland. I walked in to a place that just was vibrant. It was full of color, loud music.
Beatniks. Everything was dark, you know, and of course the girls in their underwear and loud music.
It was heaven. It really was. To me, it was the most exciting place I had ever been in my life. I was 15, and there was wonderful music, and there were people there that were like me. Different. I was always different, and I felt out of step with people that I went to school with. And when I walked in the door, I went, here's my place, my crowd, my people, and I loved it.
I was there with a bunch of journalists from the Star-Telegram. They put us at a table back in the corner, sort of away from, we didn't have to sit on the floor like the real customers did.
I've just gotten out of the U.S. Air Force. I've come back to Fort Worth. I have gone to work. I had replaced Phil Record as the night police reporter at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. hours, 6 p.m. to 3 a.m. And he said, you know, there's this thing that you're just not going to believe. He said, it's in the cellar. They have, it's a coffee house. They don't have a liquor license. They just serve coffee. You go in, there are no chairs. There are just cushions on the floor and very low tables. And of course, the first thing he told me about, and the thing that caught my attention, he said the waitresses wear underwear. That's their uniform.
When I was in high school, I was a cheerleader and fairly clean cut. And I kept seeing these guys come to school and they had black eyes and bruises. And we'd say, what in the world happened to you? And they said, we went to this place in Fort Worth called the Cellar. Don't mess up at the Cellar. Whatever you do. Couldn't wait to go.
Well, I heard that it was strictly taboo, and it was kind of the forbidden fruit of Fort Worth. Didn't want to go there unless you were ready for trouble. And of course, I'd never seen a beatnik other than pictures or movies, and couldn't wait to get in there.
I had no idea what I was walking into, and changed my life. That night I walked in there, everything changed for me.
I asked this really sweet girl out, and I didn't know where to take her, so I heard about the Cellar. I don't remember where, but so I decided to take her there. We were both scared to death.
Well, I certainly wasn't frightened. I'm 26 years old, right? I've just gotten out of the U.S. Air Force. I've come back to Fort Worth, and I walked in and I thought, my heavens, what in the world? I mean, you know, there was always a band. They always had live music. And here are these ladies sashaying around in their undies, for want of a better word, and all these people laying around and sitting on these cushions. Now, mind you, this nobody had ever seen anything, certainly not in Fort Worth, and not many people in any other place.
I was exhilarated. At the same time, I was really, really scared.
I don't remember how I never even knew about it. I'm sure somebody told me, and I went like at 15, 16 years old, and they never questioned, they never looked at IDs or anything, because I remember being in there way younger than I should have been.
All the young musicians knew about the Cellar. I mean, it had a reputation that everybody talked about and wanted to go and see what it was all about. And so I learned about it in high school. And it wasn't too soon after that I started playing there.
I grew a beard, and I couldn't find anybody that would hire me with a beard, guy with a beard. But I went up to, I said, can I fill out an application? Nobody filled out an application. So they sent me to the manager's stand, and he takes one, looks at me, he says, be here tomorrow night and wear a black t-shirt.
It was scary, weird, and kind of exciting. I kind of looked forward. Even though I just went in there, I was going to be a waitress. You know, I figured I was going to serve drinks and such. And then later on, I would become a dancing girl. The tips were better.
You know, that it was a beatnik coffee shop. That was, you know, and that fascinated me. I liked that, you know, the subculture, you know, aspect of it. The growing up in an era when there was like Dobie Gillis on TV and there was Maynard G. Krebs, the beatnik, you know, and I liked that, and I was an art student.
It was everything that I'd hoped it would be. It was dark. There were scantily clad women running around, waitresses. There was jazz music. There was a sense of danger, a crazy place. Everything was just crazy.
It was very cool. I wanted to be here. I wanted to work there. I wanted to just be involved with it.
Exciting. It was dark, mysterious, smoky, jazz music playing.
The Cellar just had that attraction, and that, you know, it was just so special and so decadent.
The joke was, you know, what was the pay? And I said, well, it was $7 a night. And somebody said, well, that's not very much money. And I said, yeah, but it's all I could afford.
I know that the music was a draw, it was great, but it was only great to the people that really were into music. The reason that people came to the Cellar was the naked waitresses.
One day, one of the girls decided it was so damn hot in there, she took her shirt off. And she got away with it. And it became amazingly wild then. That's when they got the reputation.
Men went there to see women take their clothes off. They may spend the whole night there to see one woman take her top off, to see breast.
You got paid $1 a night. And if you were late, even 5 minutes, which I always was, you didn't get paid your $1. But we made lots of money.
I had a big struggle with the waitresses because their little dance thing was right in my face. You know, our microphone was like right here and their ass was right there. And they would dance and I didn't like them dancing to my songs.
The Cellar was absolutely a place where women were objectified. But the deal was is outside the Cellar, women were coming in there and having a ball. You know, women could come in there and feel safe. The women got in free. The Cellar itself and its credo was pretty much not enlightened. It was objectifying women severely, you know. I didn't see anybody minding particularly.
They were just girls. They were just young people doing the same thing that we were doing, which was trying to figure out what they wanted to do. They were just young people, and some of them were real nice. And they came and went. They came and went. You know, it wasn't. They weren't looking for that kind of life. That was just something they were doing at that time in life. It was the same way with a lot of musicians.
It was not stripping every night. It happened every now and then. And on the weekends, to keep the crowds in, management might encourage a waitress or someone who was willing to get up and take the top off, and the guys would stay the rest of the night, hoping to see that again. This was before such things as topless bars. That was illegal. That's why they had the guy downstairs to push the button that shined the light in the cashier's eyes when he saw anyone that looked like a cop coming up the street. Then they would get the flashlight on the stage and flash the girl down, and a bouncer would run up and escort her off to the ladies' room.
So the bands bring the girls bring the guys bring the money.
A lot of the dancing girls, the biggest part of them were people that came in off the street and be drunk or something, you know, because it was an after-hours club. They'd already been drinking when they got there. They'd get up on the tables, take their clothes off. So bring on the dancing girls.
There was always a sense of danger in the Cellar because they had the baddest ass bouncers. And that was the whole story is, you know, you had to mind your P's and Q's and figure out your etiquette real quick, because if you messed up, you get your ass kicked. And worse, when it was upstairs, you'd get your ass kicked and go rolling down the stairs.
Well, I haven't been one, believe it or not. You might look at my stature now, but back when I first came to the Cellar, I weighed 215 pounds and played football and martial arts, and you know, I was pretty much in shape, 6 foot tall guy. You didn't mess up in the Cellar. There's a lot of people that kind of came to the Cellar hearing that there's a bunch of bad, tough guys in there, and there were, and usually people found out the hard way that had that attitude that they wanted to come test the waters. You usually got hurt very badly.
For 3 years running, the TCU varsity football team came down to the Cellar with the intent of whipping the beatniks. And 3 years running, the TCU varsity football team all wound up in the hospital.
Oh, you don't touch the waitress. The bouncers took care of that. And there were some bad times when they would beat the crap out of people and throw them out. You didn't want to do anything wrong in the Cellar.
I mean, you got girls walking around in their underwear, and you got people drinking, and it was a very suggestive place. They would dance, and sometimes they would strip, you know. And somebody had to keep all those cowboys in line, you know, because it could get rowdy, You know, they begin to think, oh, well, free for all, you know, but you better not touch the girls, don't touch the band, you know, or you were in trouble.
I did have a bouncer basically save my life one night in the Houston club. I had a lot of respect for them. They did a hard job. They didn't make a lot of money doing it, but they did it well.
Oh no, there were guys packing, drinking and packing and doing pills. That's a great combination, you know. You know, I was in there was a gunfight down in the Houston joint one night. We're all lined up against the wall with the lights on, and these guys come in shooting. I'm up there, the band always had to play when trouble went on, and you know, I'm up there going, y'all need to kill the lights at least. You know, we're just like a shooting gallery up here against the wall with all the lights on. There's no lights anywhere else. I'm going, kill the lights, kill the lights. And they used to holler QT4. That meant trouble, and the band had to play. You know, so yeah, it was dangerous on a small level.
People would get beat up all the time, and if it wasn't the bouncers, it would be other people in the club. But you know, if I broke out, the bouncers are going to just jump on it, and that's what you'd watch. That was part of the show too. It wasn't just watching the waitresses dance and hope that they might, you know, strip down to their underwear all the way. It was, you always had a sense something's going to happen here. There was never a night when you'd go and nothing would happen. So it was like a fight. Yeah, because once any kind of scuffle, the next thing would be watching the bouncers eject, and that was part of the show. Watching that light bulb to see if it was going to turn on, if the cops were going to come for a raid.
Pat definitely had an in with them. I think to keep the citizens of Fort Worth happy and that everything was under control, I think the police pretty much made a pretty scheduled run up those stairs and were visible at the cellar. That's what the little light system was all about, so that they didn't have to arrest anyone. They didn't really want to arrest anyone.
Here's this place right on the corner. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is like the big city. You know, I just come from Lubbock, and here's like Houston with all the banditos circling around Market Square, and they're all obviously going to be Cellar fans. There was the guy that ran it. Everybody called him Bad Bob. I don't know what his name was, but he was bad news character. And I went to the office. I remember going to the office, which is right by the front door, and I said, Bob, I've enjoyed my stint here at the Cellar Club, but I'm afraid something happened last night that I can't handle it, and I'm going to have to leave your organization. And Bob looked up at me and said, "Oh, you mean you're quitting the Cellar Club?" And I said, "Well, I can't handle this." And he reaches down in the bottom of his drawer in his office and pulls out a big old .45 and cocks it and says, "Nobody quits the Cellar Club."
We didn't have a liquor license. We didn't sell beer. We didn't sell, liquor, period. So that was the reason we were able to stay open all night till 6 in the morning.
They kept bottles behind the cashier's booth for the musicians and the managers. What they sold were alcohol-flavored drinks. All those people that got drunk out there on the cushions on those drinks, it wasn't liquor. It was only flavoring.
If you bought alcohol from the cellar, you weren't buying alcohol, you were buying a flavor. That is true. Only the regulars got what they called specials.
Everclear and food coloring.
Everclear mixed with whatever you wanted it mixed with, but they put green food coloring in it because under the black lights you could see the green food coloring, and so the management would know who actually had drinks. And they wanted to keep tabs of that because they didn't want the waitresses selling specials.
Anybody that was connected with the media, you know, television, newspapers, policemen, off duty, on duty, didn't matter. If they wanted to come in there and get a drink after hours, they knew they could get one.
Yes, the reason those of us from the Star Telegram were there was because of Kirkwood's policy of giving away free alcohol.
If you were a friend of Pat Kirkwood, the owner, they would serve these drinks that were made with Kool-Aid or grapefruit juice, and they would put grain alcohol into this stuff. And my God, I mean, people could go blind drinking a less alcoholic beverage than this.
I was there when the Secret Service agents were sitting at the big round table in front of the cash register at the back of the cellar downstairs, and they were there all night long. I was there that night, and I was there the next day after the assassination, and it was, of course, we thought we should have been closed, but, you know, yeah, it was,
I was there. I was there on that night when the Secret Service agents were there, but I didn't know who they were. Johnny Carroll told me they were there. Said, "Be on your best behavior. Secret Service agents in here tonight." But I didn't know who they were. All I know is that it was a hell of a party that didn't end until about 6 a.m. It was daylight when I walked out on the sidewalk and thought about President Kennedy speaking within the hour up at the Texas Hotel a couple of blocks away, and I was just too tired to stay. I went on home. Several of the Cellar personnel, though, walked up there and shook his hand in the line, I understand.
Later on, the Warren Commission started doing its reports. We were contacted by the Secret Service, and more or less they explained to us that Kennedy's death was due to just the act of a lone madman, and the Secret Service name has been blackened enough. And when you go to the Warren Commission, which you will be, is what they told us, that we would appreciate you wouldn't just mention that they were drinking Everclear, you know. And so Kirkwood said, "Sure." Well, so we just told them they were drinking grapefruit juice at the Secret Service request.
The night that President Kennedy came to Fort Worth, and a lot of people in that awful weekend when he was assassinated kind of overlooked the fact that he spent the night in Fort Worth. And something like 10,000 people had turned out at Carswell Air Force Base to see him. He just got this wonderful welcome. I was kind of upset because I hadn't been assigned to that story. It was a big story, but they told me, you know, your regular job is covering the police beat. The political people will cover this. So we kept the press club open late that night, so all of the members of the White House press corps could come. And you know, these were big names to us. We knew all these bylines, and these were kind of our heroes. And so once I got off work at 2 o'clock, I guess it was, Phil Record and I went over to the press club because we wanted to meet all these people, you know, Robert Pierpoint and all those kind of people, Tom Wicker of the New York Times. These were very well-known people, especially to people in journalism. So we get over there, and lo and behold, what we discover, they've all heard about the Cellar. They all want to go down to the Cellar. So Phil and I were sort of appointed to be the official guides, and we took them all down there, and everybody had a great time. And some of the Secret Service detail, they were all off duty, and they decided they wanted to go too. So they came along, and they were later really criticized for being up late and for drinking. I don't know if they were drinking or not. I've always said I didn't see any of them drinking anything down there, and maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But anyway, it was it was the dawn was breaking when the party finally broke up, and we all went home, which was why I was sound asleep the next day when my brother came in and woke me up and told me President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. But it was an amazing night there. But I guess what really surprised us was the notoriety of the Cellar. By then, I mean, people in Washington, these big bylines in the Washington Press Corps, they get to Fort Worth, and what they all wanted to do was go to the Cellar. And so we took them down there.
Sex was just a given, and nobody ever looked down on you for having sex. And people had sex with a lot of different people. It was just what they did, and women felt free, had the birth control pill, they didn't have to worry about getting pregnant, and they could do what they wanted to and have fun.
You went home with who you wanted to, when you wanted to, and if you wanted to see them again, that was fine, and if you didn't, it was fine with everybody, Free love, no nickel beer.
There were always pretty girls there, and I think it was a place for them to go and a place where they could feel good about themselves. But I think from kind of a marketing level, I think there was a reason for those pretty girls being there. I think they were encouraged to be there, and I think they were kind of given that veil of security so that they would be there to draw the guys in. And that's where the money got made.
It was already, the sexual revolution had already started at the Cellar before any of that. Like I say, about the time that everybody started taking LSD was a big part of the sexual revolution, but it was already going on at the Cellar. I mean, you didn't. It was free love and full speed ahead. Kirkwood was very, very against drugs. And of course, at that point, when that was like 66, 65, 66, 67, around in there, when everybody started smoking pot.
There was rules that we better not catch you at Trinity Park because that's where the dopers were. And Kirkwood didn't like the long-haired hippie thing. He was that beatnik era.
Well, they used to get you barred. And that's a fate worse than death, if you got barred from the Cellar. You couldn't come in anymore.
Eyes were watching you, and if you come in there acting like you were really tripping on Orange Barrel Sunshine, you better be able to handle your dope or somebody's going to tell on you and you're going to get in trouble with Kirkwood. So we were always worried about Daddy finding out,
And I got fired and barred for dropping acid, not only even at the gig, but just on my personal life. The party line was no drugs, but oh my God, Jimmy kept a bottle of uppers back there behind the, Dexedrine back there behind the booth, the manager's booth, Everybody was doing pills. I mean, and that's back when Black Mollies were Black Mollies.
Well, that was purely pragmatic. On dove hunts, Kirkwood's giving me amphetamines. He had them in his car,
And a lot of us learned to play real fast back then.
Drugs were frowned upon. Mainly, I think, their idea was just so they wouldn't get shut down.
The ones of us who had been around a little bit longer than others, we understood what the rule was. The rule was don't get caught, because if you did, well, then you brought the heat on the joint, and they couldn't have you around.
People used to smoke pot before they get there to hear the music, and they would put Visine in their eyes so that nobody would pick them off. Well, murine shows up in the black light. So a guy coming to the door to pay his $1 or $2 to get in, whatever it was, and his face would be streaked with green that you couldn't see with the regular light. But the murine showed up in the black light, and it was really funny. You picked up the pot smokers real quick.
You couldn't have all that fun and all that stuff without paying the price.
You know, because I nearly died after I left the cellar. I ended up with hepatitis from lifestyle, you know, back whenever we were really doing the wrong thing.
A lot of them got into serious writing scripts and shooting speed. You know, a lot of them, a lot of Hep C came out of that because everybody was doing it together. A whole lot of my friends are living with Hep C today.
The music, primarily when it first opened, was jazz. In fact, that was one of the slogans painted on the wall, was coffee, jazz, and thou. When the band would be taking a break, there'd be some guy up there reading some sort of poetry that didn't make any sense to anybody.
The Cellar was an adult club. Kids didn't go there very seldom. It was an adult place. The turnover was when British rock came in, and when the Cellar started hiring British rock, all of a sudden it was wall-to-wall kids.
Around the time the Beatles hit, when the whole music changed altogether anyway. And that's when we really loved it, when the long-haired bands started playing. Yes.
You have to remember, at that day and age, the bands all dressed alike, wore matching blazers or shirts or whatever, and played 45-minute sets, did all cover material, just like the record. The bands that made the most money and worked the most were the bands that did the best at cover material. And all of a sudden, here's this joint where you can go in t-shirts and jeans and play anything you want to play, really, any way you want to play it. And you got to play all night. I mean, it was heaven. It was ecstasy for a musician.
Man, you couldn't keep me away. It was not hard when you were that young.
The Cellar didn't pay but $10 a night, and you had to go to Houston to get that. But wow, I couldn't make but $1.25 an hour anyway, minimum wage.
You know, the Cellar had this great reputation of being this, you know, edgy, all night, after hours, you know, joint where there was always great musicians playing. In the 60s, there were two kinds of places. One was like the hippie flower, you know, love and peace thing. The other was kind of the old down and out dirty blues kind of joint, and the Cellar was that place.
Every time Led Zeppelin was in town, they went to the Cellar. Leslie West came to town, he went to the Cellar, Three Dog Night. These people looked forward to playing Dallas and Fort Worth area because they had experienced it too.
Many nights, Johnny Winter coming out and sitting in with you know, Rocky and Dusty, and I have to say it's where I got a lot of my early inspiration from.
The Cellar was a hotbed of music, of creativity, of music, of the coming together of musicians and artists, and it allowed anybody to do what they wanted to do, and it got so many careers off the ground.
Back in, let's see, 1960, George Carlin and Jack Burns were disc jockeys at KXOL Radio in Fort Worth, over there off West 7th Street. And they would get off at midnight and come down to the Cellar. This would be, say, late 1961. And they would come down there, and they'd go up on stage, you know, during a musician's break or something, and started doing these routines that they were working up through the radio station. And they were hilarious. And then one night they said, well, Jimmy, we're going to California to see if we can't make it big, you know, and the rest was history.
When I got involved in the Cellar, I was in school. And I quit that to be a Cellar person, which became my school. I got to rehearse and play every night of my life. I got to see things that I might, good or bad, I got to see things. And that's part of an education.
You know, you play with guys that are not as good as you, you're going to play down. You play with guys just like you, you're never going to get much better. You play with the best guys you can play with. My God, I was surrounded by the absolute best talent that I'd ever seen in my life. And you know, and I'm talking like Johnny Winter and ZZ Top, back in the old days, Steve Miller, Boss Skaggs, you know. These are guys that all came in there, did their stint.
The musicians there were just so great. The music was great. You really honed your chops because you had to play, you know, 12 hours a night, so you really had to really get good. Your fingers were, You know, there were blisters on your fingers. Your calluses were about half an inch thick, you know.
It was very competitive. Oh my God. Oh, the term, and what we all called it was gunslingers. The guitar players were like gunslingers. The new guy would come to town and everybody would take him on. You know, it's gunslinging. And some of the best were there, you know. The hottest, best guitar players in Texas went through there, you know. I'm sick of them now, but, you know.
The Cellar was like a music battleground, or you might say, because you could play anything and everything there, and you could learn from the older players who had been there for so long.
One of the beautiful things about the Cellar is you lived with these guys 8, 9, 10, 12 hours a night, and you watched people grow and you watched people fade out, you watched people get sick of it, and then you saw the real troopers are the ones that stuck with you, the ones that could handle it night after night and not go completely crazy and go out and OD on dope and die like some I knew. There came a point of reckoning where you actually started to take what you were doing very seriously.
Women's Lib didn't come up there. Certainly not desegregation.
We had a sign at the front door of all the Cellars. It said the Cellar has the highest cover charge in the world. So whenever somebody that the management didn't want to come in, they would just shine a light on that.
And so I started getting to be friends with all these guys, and I'd invite them. I'd say, hey, you guys, man, our band's playing down at the Cellar Club. Why don't y'all come down? I'll put your name on the list. And after that night, I never saw them in the club. And the next day, I went over to their place, and I said, hey, man, you guys, how come you guys didn't show up at the Cellar? And they said, oh, we did show up. And he said the guy working the door pointed up above the door. There was a sign up there that said $99 cover charge.
The Cellar was Kirkwood's idea, and it was impervious to every single thing else going on in the world.
It was naughty back then. You know, it was the beginning of the end of the innocence. Everybody would sneak out and go to the Cellar when they were 16, 17, because it was happening.
Her lifestyle was unique, amazing, thrilling, scary, inspiring, every emotion you can think of. It was learning about music and musicians and the life of women and all the things that they offer. And it was all in this one place.
As notorious as it was, its reputation, it lived up to it. We hear about this joint where the waitresses wore their underwear and sometimes would take all their clothes off, and the bands played all this crazy wild shit, and there were strobes and black lights, and I mean, there wasn't anything like that then.
Rebels. Every generation has the rebel factor. There was a lot of people that probably wouldn't have tried to do things that they did if they hadn't had that freedom. And the Cellar allowed that.
Even if you were a student at the Baptist Seminary, if you had wild hair and no one's looking, you could have been in that crowd at 1 a.m. There was something about catting around on the wrong side of the line that we celebrated. And the Cellar was on the wrong side of the line.
Well, you could do anything and everything at the Cellar. I mean, whatever you think went on, did.
Everybody thought that was really cool, you know, and you were doing something you weren't supposed to be doing. So that too kind of added to the romance of this thing and the whole idea.
Everything I was warned about was going on exactly like I heard about it, but just maybe better than what I'd heard.
I was like 15, would be like 1965. So 15, 16, you know, very formative years. And I was from a small town. My parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were all in the cattle business.
You never told your parents about the cellar. You never talked to them about, you never talked to your teachers in high school about, you didn't let on to anyone except your peers. So it was like a secret society, and that's what made it cool. It was long before being different, the whole counterculture became accepted and something that was celebrated. This was not celebrated.
You couldn't rent a room or get an apartment easily if they knew you worked at the Cellar. It had such a bad reputation.
You know, it wasn't hard to get into a fight. It was very hard to stay out of one. It was a very dangerous time. You know, they're rugged individualists.
Sure, we were friendly and we preferred peace and love, a lot of love, but you didn't cross us because we weren't turn the other cheek kind of people.
You couldn't walk down the street in downtown Houston with long hair or anything. You were just liable to get, we always went in groups or couples or something.
Especially in the 60s, it was hard being different. You know, even if you wore your hair down like on your forehead, you were being different. And anything that was different during this period of time, you really did risk getting physically beat up. And the Cellar was a free spot in that respect. It was not peace and love and flowers. You know, you screw up in here, you misbehave, you're gonna pay. And yet, it was this one place where it was okay to be kind of different. And you could be different and be amongst your peers who were seeking the other. It was all these people getting together and you know, kind of patting themselves on the back. We are all the other. And this was before hippies or Woodstock or any of this stuff came around.
I don't know. I spent 7.5 years going to the Cellar, and I still don't know what the draw was, why I couldn't leave it, and why it meant so much to me.
Everybody was young, and they were very shapeable and pliable, and that place puts you in a certain mindset.
I kind of grew up there. Well, I was 19 when I walked in, and I had just turned 21 when I left. And I already had a child.
I would be a different person today had I not gone through the Cellar, I'm sure. And I can remember one night, the joint's jumping, it's midnight, you know, I'm standing there drinking my Coca-Cola. I really didn't drink. I did all the drugs a human being could do, but I didn't drink. And this guy walks up to me and he's going, "Let me take you out of here." And I just laughed at him, you know. I'm going, what makes you think I want to leave?
Today we talk about alternative culture or the counterculture, whatever. There wasn't anything like that in Fort Worth. I mean, this was the sole touchstone for anything that was the other. You know, by 67, you might have read in the newspaper about the Summer of Love in San Francisco, and you might have, by 69, you might have had a few friends that had gone down to the Vulcan Gas Company in Austin, or maybe the Love Street Light Circus in Houston. And the Cellar represented so much more.
It changed me. I don't know, for the better, who can say, but it did change me, yeah.
The change took place through the Cellar, but the Cellar didn't change.
The bad side of it was just as bad as the good side was. It was just as evil and wicked and dangerous as it was beautiful and fun and magical.
By the way, this is the last night at the Cellar. Shut up and let's have a party. Let your conscience be your guide.
The Cellar was the last touchstone of this legacy we have in Fort Worth that goes back to Hell's Half Acre. I mean, you can make that connection and go back to there and see, draw the line and go through Camp Bowie and Jacksboro Highway all the way to the Cellar. After the Cellar, I think we're still sifting through the ashes.
It went into decline, I think, as soon as the topless bars opened and they dropped the legal drinking age to 18.
the times changed, you know, and it could go see kind of what was going on there a lot of places.
You just couldn't go back because times are so different now. It was when everything was busting wide open.
It's a different time, it's a different age. It's a moment that's frozen in all of us that wherever we're there and experienced it and smelled it and smelled of it and tasted of it. We were rich in our experience of that place.
When I started going in there, like I said, at 17. So I've got a Cellar card still to this day.
The Cellar was its own, and there never will be another one like it.
It's the quality of the music. And it's kind of like the Cavern was to the Beatles. It was a magical place.
You know, I could sit here all day and tell you what it was like, but you still wouldn't get it, because you have to have the sensibilities of that period of the 60s and the way the world was to see what a freakish place it was.
I can't get it into words what it was, but everybody that ever went in there and ended up working there, and especially the musicians, a lot of it, I guess it was the music, I guess it was just the time that it happened, it all came together to gel to make it such a life-changing experience for most of the people that spend any time there at all.
I promise you I would have probably quit playing if I could have not had that experience in the Cellar. That was like the very first time in my life that it became a very serious thing to play. It wasn't just something you did, it was something you were. The Cellar groomed you to be a professional musician if you lived through it.
I can't put my finger on it. It was just a melding of the times, and the time and the place and the people, and all of it was just right.
The Cellar was its own special thing, and there was nothing like it.
It still stands today. The people that we met and played with then, most of them still have music careers today, and I think that's a testament to what went on there. You know, it was a hard rock and roll school, and you better bring your best game.
We played all day, and then we play all night. We'd slave and never say anything for the morning light. Working Main Street